The following serial killers have at least 8 or 9 confirmed murders. Let's take a look. Keith Hunter Jesperson, aka the Happy Face Killer. Jesperson killed 8 women in the 90s, sex workers and runaways. His father was an abusive alcoholic, and his paternal grandfather was abusive as well. Here we see 3 generations of wickedness, putting points in nature as well as nurture. Jesperson was beaten and even electrocuted for bad behaviour. He was described as shy and was bullied for his large size, which is an unusual thing to be bullied for. With home and school being as stressful as it was, he strangled animals as a child, as he'd later strangle his victims. Allegedly, his father said he was proud of him for killing animals, and Jesperson even strangled animals as an adult, according to his daughter. As a youth, he attempted to kill other children, twice by drowning, and he claims to have been raped when he was 14. Jesperson tried to be a police officer at one point, but couldn't because of an injury. I'm surprised we're this deep into the project, and this is the first time law enforcement has come up. I'm sure a lot of true crime enthusiasts know the statistic that the profession with the highest number of psychopaths is law enforcement, at least for men. Jesperson met 23-year-old Tonya Bennett, who allegedly had an intellectual disability, and strangled her to death as his first victim. But early on in the investigation, something very bizarre happened. A woman named Laverne Pavlanak claimed her abusive boyfriend was responsible for Tonya's murder, and they were soon both in custody and later found guilty. Very interestingly, her boyfriend pled no contest to avoid the death penalty. What's more bizarre is that Jesperson took offence to Pavlanak and her boyfriend getting the media attention he wanted. I say it's unusual because police have been caught by hoaxes and bad leads before and since, and I should think killers liked it when it distracts the investigation. Jesperson seems to have taken it as an insult. He wrote a confession on a wall and then sent letters to the police and media. He signed all of them with a smiley face, hence the very unusual handle, and confessed to at least most of his crimes, later claiming to have killed over 100 people. He was also a rapist. They got his DNA from the stamp, and then Pavlanak and her boyfriend were released after 5 years in prison. The act of killing clearly wasn't enough for Jesperson. He wanted media attention for his crimes as well, and thus wasn't content to let others take credit for his murder. He could have just ignored it or even taken it as a grim bonus. It really makes me wonder just how often this sort of thing happens. Pavlanak was grossly irresponsible for what she did. False witness, wasting time, deception, potentially letting a real killer go free, etc. Her boyfriend was no angel, but no one deserves false imprisonment.
At the time, I could justify each and every one of those murders, and at this time I cannot.
Eric Cooke, aka the Nightcaller. The second entry for Australia committed his crimes in the late 50s and early 60s. Growing up under the terror of his alcoholic father, who would beat him to such an extent that it would hospitalise Cooke for head trauma. He was bullied owing to scarring for an operation to remedy his cleft lip, and was in and out of foster care, and was weirdly accident-prone. His adolescent life was marred with juvenile delinquency, vandalism, theft, and even arson. He burnt down a church after he was rejected for the choir. He also joined the Australian Army, but was kicked out when they learned of his criminal record. And then his murders began. Cooke had no set MO or weapon of choice. Victims were shot, stabbed, bludgeoned, etc. Some he just killed during a burglary, but at least one victim he committed necrophilia against and staged the body in a degrading way. Interestingly, another man was wrongfully convicted of 2 of Cooke's murders, but he was soon pardoned. Cooke himself was arrested via police staking out a ditched gun in the bushes, and Cooke was executed soon after.
And Franklyn, I've taken him with a hit on the body.
John Christie, aka Reggie No Dick. I don't mean to be crude or disingenuous, but given we've had killers with handles like the Night Stalker, the Vampire of Sacramento, and the Iceman, I find it refreshing at least one serial killer doesn't have a cool name. I've just realised that the killers I picked with the coolest names are all called Richard. What are the odds? Anyway, I sometimes wonder if we did give killers silly and rude nicknames, however childish, it might put off the killers that are interested in the media and attention. Christie is another early serial killer, active in the 40s and 50s. His home life was troubled by a tyrant father, mother and sisters. His grandfather was also abusive, and when Christie saw his grandfather's dead body, he said he was happy. He was also a good student with an IQ of 128, which is nearly high IQ territory. But what about that name? I don't know if the papers called him that, but I do know it comes from his adolescence, cruel mocking from peers that he was impotent. Christie joined the army and served in the First World War, getting gassed in the line of duty. Upon returning home, he was involved in a great many offences, including theft, fraud, larceny, assault, and grand theft auto. He was also married, separated, and then got back with his wife during this time. After a period of apparently going straight, the Second World War broke out, and Christie enlisted in the Reserve Police. I'm not sure how they missed his lengthy criminal record, but there was a war on. It seems like the serial killers who didn't engage in juvenile delinquency and didn't have a record gravitated to policing, and we'll see that more going forward. Some got accepted, some didn't, but Christie is a rare combination of someone with a criminal history and a job in law enforcement. During this time, Christie had an affair with a married woman. The husband found out and beat him up. Before the Second World War ended, Christie committed his first murder, a prostitute he strangled. 7 more victims would follow, but there's something involving Christie that has stayed with me for years. Christie murdered the wife and daughter of Timothy Evans, and then Christie was a witness to the prosecution in court, giving evidence that Timothy Evans murdered his wife and daughter. Evans was falsely put to death. Unlike Jesperson, Christie ultimately diverted the investigation and got a case closed and got any possible attention off him. Bodies were perfectly disposed of, and he made himself look good. He showed great deviousness and cunning, and a complete lack of remorse. I think Evans should count as a murder victim, even though the murder weapon was the British courts and police incompetence. And Christie wasn't done yet. Christie next murdered his own wife and sold her belongings. With the property to himself, he murdered more women, at least one of whom was a prostitute. He raped them, strangled them, committed necrophilia with their bodies. The dead bodies he kept in the flat were eventually discovered, resulting in Christie's arrest. One of the final few women and Timothy Evans' wife were pregnant when they died, and there's some evidence Christie killed a few more women. He had a grim collection of pubic hair for trophies. Finally, Reggie Nodick was executed in 1953, and around a decade later, after a very controversial inquiry, Evans was posthumously pardoned. This case has fascinated and frightened me ever since I heard about it. I can't imagine the horror Timothy Evans went through for losing his family and then his own life, as the killer looked on with glee. It certainly helped the case for the abolition of capital punishment in this country. Too bad it helped the Moors murderers. John Edward Robinson, aka the Internet Slavemaster. Called as such because he was perhaps the first serial killer to get victims via the internet, Robinson ultimately killed 8 women. His father was an alcoholic, his mother was a tyrant, and he once worked a medical type job as a radiographer. At this job, Robinson embezzled cash and committed fraud. He got a lot of jobs during this time. He seemed to take anything he could, and stole everything he could. He was imprisoned several times for fraud and the like, but then women started disappearing, and some of the bodies have never been found. There was one incident where he seduced the prison librarian and she left her husband for Robinson. Her body was later found at a storage facility. Robinson's younger victims would be his willing or unwilling sex slaves, and the older victims had their pension checks cashed by him. He sent fake letters to the families to close investigations and told so many lies to so many people, it's impossible to document them all. Danny Rolling, aka the Gainesville Ripper. About a quarter of the way through the project, and I'm already sick of reporting on a tyrant father figure in the serial killer's early life. But Danny Rolling's dad, James Rolling, was something else. He was a tyrant to the whole family. Everyone was beaten and terrorized, even Danny's dog, which would eventually die. I don't see any evidence that James Rolling was an alcoholic, but he was a cop and a war veteran. Danny Rolling himself tried to join the Navy and then enlisted in the Air Force, but he was kicked out. He has a criminal history as a robber, burglar, and a peeping Tom. But then the murders started. He killed a family of 3 in Louisiana and posed the body of the female for police to find. The youngest victim was 8 years old. A year later, Danny, aged 36, tried to kill his father, shooting him a few times. James lost an ear and one of his eyes. Danny Rolling then killed 5 students in Gainesville, Florida, often during burglaries, and then posed the bodies for others to find. One of his student victims was male, but the remaining 4 were female, all of which were petite white brunettes with brown eyes, like Rolling's mother. At this point, I want to put on my amateur Freudian hat, pondering about the Oedipal struggle and whatnot, but I'll hold it for now. It's clear that Rolling stalked these victims and chose them carefully, and once again I'm making a comparison to Ted Bundy, who did something similar. Rolling also raped most of his victims. It's not clear if he was a torturer, but he really sliced his victims up with his knife. If parts of this sounds familiar, it should be noted that Rolling loosely inspired the Scream films, a series about a madman with a knife and a tendency to pose the college-aged victims. The police followed a promising lead of a mentally ill person, but he was soon cleared. Eventually, the Louisiana killing spree and the Florida murders were connected by similarities in the scenes, and someone who knew Rolling eventually called the police. Rolling was already in custody for a robbery. Apparently, Rolling wanted to top Ted Bundy, so thankfully he was stopped relatively early. Rolling was diagnosed as an ASPD and a BPD comorbid, and was also diagnosed with paraphilia, but I don't know much about this. His IQ was 110 or 115, giving him above average intelligence, but he has an emotional age of perhaps 15. Before his execution, he seduced his biographer Sondra London, and they were even to be married. Maybe I'll explore her at a later date. As for Rolling, there was a crazed nastiness to this one, and I have to say, he looks pathetic in almost every photograph I can find of him.
There are some things that you just can't run from.
Sean Vincent Gillis, aka the Other Baton Rouge Slayer. Sean Gillis killed 8 women between 1994 and 2004 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He raped at least some of his victims, and there is evidence of necrophilia. Gillis was raised by his mother and grandparents after his father abandoned the family, and in his adolescence he had some comparatively minor juvenile delinquency. After getting caught, the police found an extensive collection of photographs of the victims, thus making the guilty verdict easy. But this case was complicated by something else. There was another serial killer active in the Baton Rouge area in the 90s called Derek Todd Lee. I've not included him in the project, but maybe I should have. He killed 7 women. There isn't too much to say about either of these men, but curiously both of them crossed racial lines. Like many serial killers, Gillis followed his case on the news, and mutilated the bodies to make the investigation more difficult. and like many others, DNA was vital in catching him, especially as his confession wound up not being admissible in court. I don't understand why. In closing, I found out that Gillis openly admitted he wanted to have sex with his mum, and that neighbours often heard him shouting at his mum.
I'm sorry I hurt people. But I would do it again.
Joachim Kroll, aka the Ruhr Cannibal. The West German district of Ruhr was stalked by an exceptionally disturbing individual for 22 years. I hadn't heard of this one before I started this project, and the same can be said for dozens of others, but Joachim Kroll stands out. Born 17th of April 1933, I don't know how much he remembered or internalised of the war, and details of his family and background are unclear. What is known is he was the last of 8 children, and perhaps a month after his mother's death in 1955, he committed his first known rape and murder when he was 22 years old. He had a sex doll at home he would strangle and practice on prior to this assault. Ultimately, he was found guilty of killing 8 young women, but confessed to 13 or 14, sources vary. Most of his victims were younger than 25, but one victim was 61. She was raped and strangled. The 2 youngest victims were 4 and 5 years old, and at least one of those was raped as well. Kroll was cannibalizing victims from early on in his criminal career. Cannibalism has so far only come up with Richard Chase, but Kroll took it to a new extreme, cutting the flesh, particularly of the buttocks, off some victims for full consumption later. I had regretted that I couldn't cover the early 20th century German cannibal trio, but with those cases I get the impression economic desperation fueled their cannibalism, a commentary on the hard times. But with Joachim Kroll, cannibalism was allegedly just to save on shopping bills. Kroll committed a few rapes and molestations that didn't result in a death, and he attacked a couple in 1965, stabbing the male to death, but the female got away. Eventually, Kroll would also be charged for an attempted murder, as well as the 8 murders. As I find myself reeling from all these details, there's another cruel twist in this story. 6 different men were arrested for Kroll's crimes, and 3 of them committed suicide. A mechanic called Heinrich Ott hung himself in jail. A boyfriend of one of the victims, Adolf Schickel, committed suicide after being ostracized by the community, and a man called Walter Quicker was also driven by neighbours to suicide. He was a known paedophile, though. Another known paedophile called Vincent Kuhn was also arrested and convicted, doing 6 years for the crime. A man called Peter Shea was arrested after confessing to the crime after he was also hounded by the community. Clearly panic and horror had set in and hysteria took its toll. A man called Horst Otto also confessed to one of the murders. He did 5 or 8 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. It isn't clear why he confessed. Kroll was apprehended after a massive outcry over the disappearance of the 4-year-old and the observation that his drains were blocked with guts. Apparently, Kroll believed the authorities would cure him of his homicidal behaviour, but instead they locked him up and threw away the key. He died of a heart attack in 1991, aged 58. One source says he was a bedwetter with an IQ of 76. Another source said he was a necrophile. All 3 of these details make sense, but I'm unsure whether I should include them. I'm worried this is another case where rumour and hearsay have corrupted the documents, like with the falsely accused men. I'll consider them for now, but if there's a book on Kroll, I'd very much like to read it. I feel like I'm missing so much from this case. Joseph Paul Franklyn, aka the Racist Killer. In the late 70s, Joseph Paul Franklyn killed at least 8 people and is suspected of killing up to 20. Born James Clayton Vaughn Jr., he was originally named after his father, who abandoned the family but would occasionally return to beat everyone and was arrested for drunkenness. Joseph was malnourished and abused. At a young age he embraced Nazism, and changed his name in honour of Paul Joseph Goebbels and Benjamin Franklin. As a Nazi, I considered excluding him on political grounds, but I feel he's a serial killer first and a terrorist second, in contrast to Ted Kaczynski. Franklin was homeless and funded himself through bank robbery and selling blood before committing many horrible acts. He firebombed a synagogue, though no one died. He killed an interracial couple, killed another man at a synagogue, attacked another interracial couple, the female survived, killed a black Taco Bell manager for associating with white women, killed 2 pubescent boys, allegedly killed another interracial couple, and 4 more people. He also allegedly shot a pornographer for displaying interracial sex, and allegedly shot a black civil rights activist. FBI profiling was useful in finding him, and ultimately Franklin was sentenced by a black prosecutor and attacked him at the trial. Supposedly, before his execution, he renounced racism. I suppose he learned his lesson, it's just a shame it was so late. But even that story is debated, with another source saying he did not renounce racism and indeed gave no final statement before execution.
And when I did see some people, I began firing on them.
Richard Cottingham, aka the Torso Killer. Also known as the New York Ripper and the Times Square Killer, Cottingham has confirmed to have killed 11 women, so should be further down, but his current conviction of 8 sets his position here. However, he may be responsible for up to a staggering 85 murders against women. His current confession count stands at 18 as of July 2023, and that was lower when I originally wrote this portion. Cottingham was also a serial rapist, and in at least one instance he burnt the bodies of 2 sex workers. Cottingham was one of the serial killers who'd stuffed dead bodies into hotel mattresses, and there was evidence he tortured some of his victims. The final victim was tortured, but luckily the police were called before she was murdered. Victims were physically beaten and strangled to death after being raped. He'd often remove the head and hands of his victims to prevent identification. Cotton was said to be respected in his community, and he may also have taken trophies of his crimes, but I can't find further verification on that. What I find most worrying about this case is the lack of trauma history. I can't find anything to suggest why Cottingham did the things he did, apart from jumping to the conclusion of nature as a congenital psychopath. He's one of relatively few serial killers who have this attribute, and it worries me.
Obviously, I must be sick somehow. Normal people don't do what I did.
Peter Kurten, aka the Vampire of Dusseldorf. The second entry from Germany is another colourful character, and next to Karl Panzram, Kurten is the earliest serial killer in the 100 Serial Killer Project, being active mostly in the 1920s. Kurten's inclusion is partly attributed to his notoriety and his inclusion on many serial killer lists: murderer, rapist, necrophile, early history of arson, attempted murder, again drowning and possibly real murder, and zoosadism. His mother was an alcoholic, his father was an alcoholic, the whole family were beaten, and the parents performed sexually for their children. His father even raped one of Kurten's sisters, and Kurten went on to try and rape the same sister. Kurten is ticking a lot of boxes. But Kurten took it a step further with zoophilia, and even combined zoophilia with zoosadism to achieve orgasm. This also included more typical activities such as fraud and theft. He was also drafted into the Imperial Army and continued committing acts of arson, and his first murder was a 9-year-old girl killed during a burglary. He'd kill, molest and burn another 9-year-old girl a few years later. After committing several brutal murders, stabbings and rapes, he drank the blood of at least one victim and actually posted an anonymous letter to the police confessing to these crimes, and later on he sent a second letter detailing more of his crimes. It was at this point Ernst Gennett became involved. Gennett is easily a hero of true crime, having a very successful law enforcement career against both Kurten and Fritz Harman a few years prior. A series of failed hammer attacks allowed several witnesses to identify Kurten, but his undoing was a strange string of coincidences involving a failed assault, a written letter, and a nosy clerk who handed the letter to Gennett. The rest is history. Curiously, Kurten seemed to really care for his wife, telling her to turn him in for the reward money when the police were closing in. This detail is particularly bizarre to me. Why would a serial killer this depraved care about his wife? He had even cheated on her several times, but this displays a sense of sacrifice. It seems even the worst of us have loved ones in what I call a morality pet. Kurten was ultimately convicted of 9 counts of murder, 7 accounts of attempted murder, and a litany of other crimes. He was sentenced to death by guillotine and asked his psychiatrist if after decapitation he would be able to hear his own blood gushing from his neck, remarking that would be the pleasure to end all pleasures. Peter Kurten is another serial killer where I'm worried the myth has overtaken the reality. The same worry I always have with early 20th century serial killers. If it's all true, he is easily one of the most disturbed, perverted and depraved individuals who ever lived. Kurten's head is on display at Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. William Peirce Jr. William Peirce Jr. killed 9 people, mostly women, in the early 70s. At least 2 of his victims were raped, and others were shot as collateral damage for some robberies he was committing. Peirce's mother was a tyrant who'd beat him, and it was found Peirce has an IQ of somewhere between 70 and 75, making him another low IQ killer. Still, he enlisted with the army, which I didn't think you could do if your IQ was that low, but left after a few months. Apparently he endured a head injury at some point after this, and he became what I can only describe as narcissistic. I'm not convinced one can get narcissism as an adult, so it's likely his injury allowed existing psychological problems to emerge or be enhanced. As a result, Peirce became a thief, a robber, and an arsonist, being arrested and imprisoned a few times. Several years later, after being released from prison aged 39, he raped and murdered a woman during a burglary. There were several other murders, and he killed any witnesses to his robberies of a store and service station. He was quickly captured after a witness gave his description. Peirce died in 2020 after spending nearly 50 years in prison. As I reflect, an idle thought crosses me. Maybe we wish serial killers were intelligent because we consider it insulting to be brutalized and murdered by a simpleton. Unfortunately, it seems to happen more often than not. Kenneth McDuff, aka the Broomstick Killer. In the 60s, McDuff murdered 3 teenagers, 2 males, 1 female, after repeatedly raping the female and breaking her neck with a broomstick. He was sentenced to death, commuted to life in prison, then got early parole, then killed 6 more women. This detail gives him the longest criminal history thus far, spanning almost 30 years with a lengthy incarceration in between. I also get the impression this one may have been spoilt as a child, a case of my beloved smother, very much like Ted Bundy. Otherwise, McDuff's history suggests a low trauma background, though he was reportedly a bully and a burglar, and would serve time in prison for burglary and getting an early parole then as well. McDuff resumed killing very soon after his release, with rape and torture added to his crimes. Some of his victims were prostitutes, and his final victim was pregnant with her 3rd child as she died, and he may have killed more. Many of his victims were kidnapped for a period of time. Finally, McDuff was executed in 1998, aged 52. I think his mother had died of old age before then because no one claimed Kenneth's body. This case is a harsh reminder that life should mean life, and it's likely a case death penalty advocates will cite for hundreds of years. Joel Rifkin. Rifkin killed 9 women and is suspected of perhaps 17 total murders. Rifkin dismembered a lot of his victims to try and avoid detection, and some of the victims were spread out over large areas, and some were never found at all. He took a lot of trophies from victims, including underwear, driver's licenses, jewellery, and a library card. Adopted as a child after his biological parents were too young to raise him, he had a fairly miserable childhood and was bullied. Before Rifkin committed his first murder, his adopted father committed suicide due to ongoing cancer problems. Some sources suggest Rifkin had a learning disability, while other sources say his IQ was at 128, which would make him above average and close to high IQ territory. I don't know who to believe. I think all of Rifkin's victims were prostitutes. Most, if not all, were strangled. And one victim was the girlfriend of punk rocker Dave Rubenstein of Reagan Youth. Rubenstein would later commit suicide via overdose after another tragedy involving his mother. Rifkin was caught after being spotted driving without a license plate, and he's not the first or last killer to be caught due to a minor violation.
Drug-addicted, disease-carrying vermin is the lie I told myself.
Okay then. I now have a decent sample size, so I will attempt a preliminary analysis.